Hey, what's going on, guys? It's me, Train Man, and welcome back to the Zombie Train. And welcome back to the Zombie Train Incorporated Tales from World War Z. That's officially what this is called now, even though I just sort of came up with it off the top of my head. Let me very briefly, of course, go over what's happening today. This is episode 172 or 171. This is 171. And this week we do a lot of work around this area south of the dam. Actually, it's not south of the dam. Yes, this is south of the dam. Unfortunately, it's not a very work-intensive episode. It's got a lot less working than it does have thinking. So I'm sort of in the same position here as I am with the old main. But you guys will see what I mean as I get to it, because there's a lot of deliberating as to what the area is going to be like. And the reason I say that is because once I make my decision on something, I really don't like to go back on it. So before I make my decision on what an area is going to look like geographically, I want to take all the factors into account. And I actually screwed up a little bit around here. You'll see towards the end of the episode. I build what I just built, and I have to undo some of that. I have to clear some of that up. But anyways, you'll see more of that if you actually pay attention to the video, but I don't really expect you to. The time lapse is just for me to get some work done on the Iron Horseman Railroad. Anyways, the episodes are coming up very quickly. But this episode of the Zombie Train, somebody asked me, let me go real quick to the video itself. Zonda 599 Major, it'd be fascinating to think about what the rail situation in Great Britain would be like in this situation, especially given the higher level enthusiasm for restoration. Now, I started off by saying I could go on at length, and I will. But let me just reiterate what I said in the comment here. They were without a doubt our worst enemies during Zombie Train Incorporated, or at least one of them, because okay, let me lay down the situation for Britain. Britain has a higher population density than the United States overall, on average. You know, obviously, the United States in places like New York, which I really don't like to talk about New York, and you guys know why, was hit immensely hard because you had a lot of people in confined spaces, and, you know, despite the fact that you could make armed defenses against the city, at the very beginning people were not educated enough, and the zombies seem to be coming out of nowhere, because the virus has a very long incubation period. Well, long-ish. I believe it's upwards of 24 hours before you start to notice the first signs. And yeah. So, anyways, and if I recall my, anatomy correctly, or etc., you can pick it up through any bodily fluid. So it's not like you have to be bitten. But that's, one of the most common ways to do it, because that's what zombies will go after. That's just their basic instinct. Anyways, so the Britons, right? Because, first of all, Britain is not as heavily armed as the United States. Per capita guns are so much lower. The US is a standout in terms of how many guns we have per individual, and that made a lot of communities very well suited in the US for fighting zombies. However, it also meant that a lot of people died to other people, So it had its trade-offs. But Britain did not have those problems, nor did it have those solutions. So you had a wave of zombies essentially sweeping through Britain, and as soon as the military was unable to hold them back, necessarily, then they were pretty much toast. There were plenty of survivors, and by plenty, I don't mean a huge amount, I don't mean a large percentage, but there were plenty. There was a solid group of probably several thousand, maybe, what's the population of Britain right now? Population of Britain. Or, back in 2012. So, 64.1 million in the UK. And that's not just on the main island, but 64.1 million. So, if 1% survived, they would have had 600,000. Unfortunately, with odds like that, then the numbers drop even more. So, I don't know the actual count of the approximate percentage of people that survived, but the main group that we had to deal with was in the 10,000 range, in the tens of thousand range, maybe cracking 100,000. But these were the Britons. So they very quickly ran out of supplies on the island. And that's easily reachable supplies. They did not have a lot of land area to go to, obviously. And they didn't have a lot of, resources that they could gather themselves. And, they were all set for food more often than not. But they didn't have a manufacturing capability or very much of one. And they did not have a capability to gather resources in any large amount. Because they didn't have enough people in the grand scheme, and they simply didn't have the resources because England is frankly kind of small. Compared to the US at least. This is my point of view. If they didn't want to grow their population or whatnot, they probably could have made do. But that wasn't the case. So they turned to the sea. And this is something that a lot of people did, but of course, like us, their supplies of gasoline ran out very quickly. And the military at this point was virtually nowhere to be found. So they made their own military, unsurprisingly enough, and, they organized, and that's when they created the name the Britons. And again, I'm not hugely firm on everything that went on the British Isles, because they were enemies, and I don't get to look at enemies' logbooks more often than not. So, they took to the seas. They didn't need a vastly spanning rail network, so they never really had anything like the Zombie Train Incorporated. They had a few engines here and there, which, of course, when they ran out of petroleum, they switched to coal because they could get it more easily, despite the fact that it was difficult for them to justify the manpower to mine it, because they wanted people making food. And so they had a good number of steam engines running, and obviously Britain is very good with restoration and preservation. But, again, they wanted to take to the seas. And the first thing they did was take the Trincomalee, which is a sailing frigate, and sort of raid their neighbors. And so that meant any, settlements along the coast of France, along the coast of, sort of the Nordic countries, as well as the other islands nearby, that'd be Ireland. And Iceland, I don't think they touched, because it was fairly strongholdy. But they raided those settlements, and when they had enough of that, or, when they faced enough opposition which would eventually wither with time, they decided they needed another ship. They had a few options. They had the Unicorn, which was a Leda class, same as the Trincomalee. These are sailing frigates, which they eventually did put masts on and get working. They had the Waverley, which is a paddle steamer. Although it has no guns on it, so they used it for towing destroyers sometimes, when they could get their hands on actual military hardware, which, again, with the military nowhere to be found, not immensely difficult. Not immensely easy, but not immensely difficult at the same time. Especially when a good number of these survivors were former military personnel. So, they used the PM Waverley for towing, they used it for shipping, for things coastal and on rivers. They had one destroyer in particular, I don't remember the name of it, it's sitting in, I think it's in London, starts with a B. And they used that against us once, but it was being towed, once again. They did not have they could not justify using the petroleum product, I assume it's diesel? Or maybe bunker sea oil, but I assume it's diesel. To get the thing to move on its own, because they had coal and they could use coal with the Waverley. So, they did that. They brought that thing to bear against us once, it was not fun. Anyways, we were much farther along, so that's in the future. I know I've only got like 5 minutes, but that's in the future. They ended up sacrificing a lot of their steaming capability, and a lot of their steam engine capability, I should say, to bring out what essentially was their trump card, and that was the HMS Warrior. If you don't know what the ship is, I recommend you look it up. It is a piece of history, and it is beautiful, but it is not beautiful when it's pointing all of its guns at you. So, anyways, while they were working on that, and while they were working on the Leda class, the Unicorn, they took the Trincomalee across the ocean and attempted to take the Constitution from us. This coincided with us getting the Constitution, so this was fairly early in the war. It was, there's another sailing ship out there that we can take, let's go for it, balls out, grab it, take it back to England if we can. Of course, they didn't succeed at that, but that was their first attempt. So then they got the Leda class and the Warrior up and running after, I think, a couple of years. It ended up using a lot of boilers off of steam engines. They sacrificed several steam engines to get the boilers to put in the Warrior to get it steaming again. Because right now the Warrior has replica boilers, as well as a couple of other replica things. It was in sorry shape at one point. So they turned again to the seas. They did not have as much of a locomotive presence as we did. In the end, we defeated them in what I called the Meeting on the Seas, which was after we went, we being the Zombie Train Incorporated, to, was it Greece? It was around that area. It was close to the Mediterranean Sea, to meet with a group of, basically, it was basically a group of engineers heading a company of people, a company of survivors, that were being besieged by the Britons, in one case, besieged by zombies in another case, and also having to deal with the Russians, who were just sort of all over the place. If you read in World War Z about what went on in Russia, and especially with the Russian army, it is... I don't know how to explain it. I'd recommend the read. Again, I can't recommend that book enough. An Oral History of the Zombie War, it covers everything that I'm not going to. And even some things that I will, like Yonkers. But they had the components and expertise that we, the Zombie Train Incorporated, needed to refine petroleum, refine crude. And so we went across the ocean, we went across the Atlantic Ocean, again, having to go past Britain, to take these guys, to first strike a deal and then take them, their expertise, and their materials back home across the Atlantic to the United States. The Britons got in the way of this several times. And that's why I say they were our worst enemy. They never made an attack on the continental United States, excluding the original bid to get the Constitution, but they did sort of harass everyone around them. Once the infighting on the island had subsided, they managed to sort of get their control and get stuff under control, and I am not hugely versed, but based on the way that Europe is looking, especially Western Europe, after World War Z sort of died down and ended, it's very much under sort of Britain, the control of the Britons, so it's under British rule. I'm sure the old empire builders would have been proud, but they managed to get stuff built up despite a crippling defeat. And I say crippling like it was a immensely glamorous victory for us. It was not. We both lost a lot of personnel, but they lost more personnel and significantly more material out in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean when the USS Olympia, which is a armored cruiser, which we brought back into service, the USS Constitution, which of course you know what that is, and the the SS John W. Brown, which is a Liberty ship, which kind of was the highlight of our cargo carrying capacity, because we had two of them. And similar to steam engines, they were one of the designs that we picked out to build more of when we needed them, which we did in the end. Because Liberty ships were immensely easy to produce. That was their whole thing when they made them. They made them by the dozen, they made them by the 1,000. They're very good bulk carriers, even if they're slow. So, John W. Brown, USS Olympia, USS Constitution versus the Trincomalee, the Unicorn with everything, with all its fixings, and the Warrior with all of her fixings. And that was a battle we would have lost if it weren't for almost what you would call divine intervention. The ZDZ-1, the Enterprise, showed up and sort of saved the day. I wasn't sure which way the battle was going to go, but I had a bad feeling until that thing showed up. I'll post a link to that in the description, but I'll see you next week. Trainman out.